Hi, and welcome back to the Archer Sew Along. In today's lesson, I'll discuss the specifics involved in cutting your archer, and I'll also give you some tips for cutting stripes, plaids, and directional fabrics. If you missed our previous lesson on pattern adjustments, you can find that in our YouTube profile under the Archer Sew Along series. I hope you all have your patterns ready because it's time to grab those scissors and get cutting. Before we get started with our fabric, let's briefly talk about how woven fabric is made. As you can see in this image, woven fabric is constructed by weaving horizontal weft yarns over and under a series of vertical warp fibers. This action is done on a loom. The horizontal weft yarns run along what we call the cross grain, and the vertical warp yarns form the straight grain. At either edge, running along the length of the fabric, is the selvage. This is a tightly woven edge finish created during manufacturing, and this is what you'll align your pattern's grain line with. Now we'll discuss pre-treating and prepping our fabric. You'll want to pre-wash and dry your fabric prior to cutting to reduce or eliminate shrinkage in your final garment. Make sure you wash your yardage using the same method and settings that you're planning to use to wash your finished garment. So say you want to wash your finished archer on cold, then you'd wash your yardage on cold. If you're going to wash the finished archer on warm, wash the fabric on warm. Same thing goes for drying. The last thing you want is your garment shrinking after you've finished it and you spent so much time getting that right fit. Once out of the dryer, you'll want to give your fabric a good press. Cutting is always easier on a nice flat fabric, so don't skimp on this step. If you're working with a particularly wrinkly fabric, like this linen, taking the fabric out of the dryer just before it's completely bone dry and pressing it then can help get the wrinkles out better. The next step in cutting your pieces is laying out the fabric. Laying out your fabric is pretty straightforward. First off, you're going to need to determine the right and wrong side of your fabric. If you're using a printed fabric, this is easy. The printed side is the right side. So here you can see the printed right side and the wrong side. Solid fabrics and fabrics with woven designs can be a bit harder. There are too many types of woven fabrics to cover them all here, but if you can't tell which is the right or wrong side, here are a few clues that might help. The first thing you can do is check the selvage. Sometimes fabric manufacturers will print text on the selvage. The text is almost always on the right side. So here you can see the text on the right side and nothing on the wrong. If the selvage has holes, the raised side would most likely be to the right side due to the way fabric is finished, though there are exceptions to this rule. If you have a fabric with a woven design, there will often be floats on the wrong side of the fabric. Here you can see the floats on the wrong side and then the smooth design on the front. If you have a fabric like this cotton stripe and you still can't tell which is the right or wrong side, all you have to do is pick the side you like best, or just choose a side and commit to it. When doing this, make sure you mark one side of all your pattern pieces as either the right or wrong side to avoid confusion during the sewing process. For example, you can place a chalk mark, a piece of tape, or a safety pin onto the right side of the garment, so that way you have the right side facing out consistently, or rather than the right side, you have the same side facing out consistently. You'll now lay your fabric out with the selvages together. A lot of people have you fold the right sides of the fabric together, but I prefer to fold mine with the right sides facing out. If you're working with a stripe or print, I find it much easier to choose which parts of the print I want where when the right side is facing out. Often it's harder to see the print on the wrong side of the fabric due to the printing techniques used. This means you will potentially struggle more with pattern matching. Once your selvages are aligned, check to make sure there's no torquing at the folded edge. If your fabric is folded on grain, the folded edge will lay nice, smooth, and flat. If the fabric is off grain, the folded edge will twist and torque as it's doing here. So what you do is you just move the fabric one selvage down and kind of smooth it out. And here you can see the selvages are aligned and the folded edge is smooth. Now that our fabric is properly laid out, it's time to place our pattern pieces. To lay out your fabric, start by locating the cutting diagrams in your instruction booklet. Each of our patterns has a complete set of cutting diagrams, which we have designed to give you the best fabric yield. Select the layout that matches your fabric width, pattern size, and which version of the pattern you're cutting. One thing to keep in mind with these layouts is that we have not laid them out for directional fabric. Directional fabric is a fabric with a clear top and bottom to the print or design, such as flowers with a stem, people, etc. When cutting directional fabric, you'll want to make sure that the tops of each pattern piece align with the top of the print. So for the archer, our diagram for non-directional fabric has the pattern pieces laid out like so. If we had a directional print where the top of the print is to our left and the bottom of the print is to our right, we'd need to realign the pattern pieces like this. Now the tops of the pattern pieces are to the left, same as our print, and the bottoms are to the right, also same as our print. When working with horizontal stripes, there are a few points to consider. If you want the horizontal stripes to line up across the body and the sleeves, here's what I do. You're going to start by drawing a line from one underarm intersection to the other on the sleeve. Then go to your back and do the same. At the front, you'll draw a line from the intersection over to the center front, and this will be perpendicular to center front. And then on the button band, just align the two pieces and continue the line over. Then when cutting, you'll choose one stripe and you'll align this line that you drew with some part of that stripe and keep that consistent. So here you can see we have this pink stripe, and the line that I drew aligns with the top of the pink stripe on all pieces. And you can see how those will align once the pattern is sewn together. The only place that it might not align perfectly is the top of the sleeve cap. You'll be able to get pretty close, and then it's going to fall apart as you round the sleeve cap. And the only way to get those to line up would have been if the pattern was drafted with your particular stripe in mind, and we all know it wasn't, so don't worry about that. There's nothing you can do. Now we're going to talk about vertical stripes. On view A, because of the pleat in the back, you'll be unable to get the stripes to line up across the yoke and back seam. You can see here, if we fold our pleat, they almost line up, but here at the center you have two green stripes. The green stripe aligns with a white stripe, the green stripe with a white stripe, and then back. So it's close, but it's not going to be perfect. What you can do instead is cut your yoke on the cross grain, and then you end up with something like this, where it doesn't matter if they don't match because you have this contrast yoke. I think it looks really nice, and it's a great way to avoid having things almost match but not quite. Now on view B, you will be able to match your stripe across the yoke and back seam because there's no pleat. But it also looks nice having it on the cross grain. The thing you need to worry about with view B is the lower back panels. So because this is gathered, it's not going to align to this. I personally don't have a problem with the gathers not matching at the back because there's just so much going on. It just doesn't bother me. But if it does bother you, you can cut that panel on the cross grain as well. And then you, again, don't have to worry about it matching. And it's kind of cute with the horizontal stripe, the vertical, and then the horizontal. But however you feel like you want to do it is how you should do it. Now let's talk a bit about plaids. They're a little more difficult because we're not just aligning a horizontal or a vertical stripe. We're aligning a horizontal and a vertical stripe. And often the designs aren't symmetrical. They're repeating. So we have light blue, green, dark blue, yellow, light blue, green, instead of coming out from the center. So because of this, it's going to be impossible to get a yoke cut on the straight grain to align. You can see here, nothing even remotely matches up. So what I do is I cut my yoke on the bias. And that way you have an interesting cross pattern. It looks great. You don't have to worry about things aligning, which is really nice. The only thing to keep in mind if you're cutting your yoke on the bias is that things are going to stretch more because it is on the bias. So I recommend cutting your outer yoke on the bias and your inner yoke on the straight grain. That way, when you put them together, the inner yoke stabilizes the outer. So your garment will look like this on the outside and this on the inside. And nobody's gonna care if it matches up on the inside. It's facing your back, but it will make your life a lot easier while sewing. Additionally, for plaids, I like to cut the pockets and the button band on the bias. It's much easier to line up the button bands this way, and I just think the pockets are a nice contrast on the bias. The sleeves not only have pleats, but they also have this curved edge and a placket. So if you want to align a print across this seam, it's going to be difficult, but not impossible. This cuff does not sew to the sleeve like this. It sews like this. These underarm seams are sewn together, and this is where we cut open for the placket. So the opening of the cuff will be here. And this is the front. You can see one notch, two notches. One notch is front, two notches is back. So you'll align your sleeve this way with the cuff if you want to run a stripe across the two. Now, there are so many options for layout with a shirt. There's a lot of pieces, a lot of possibility. So I've created these two downloadable design sheets so that you can print them out and test your fabric alignment before you cut. You'll find them on our blog, and I'll link to these in the description below as well. You can see here that I've colored view A in for my shirt. It's really helpful. There's 3 different color stripes on my fabric just to try to figure out how I want those to align. One additional important thing to note before we start our layout is that for the archer, our 2 front pieces are not identical. Therefore, we only need to cut one of each. You can cut these separately with the fabric flat if you like, but what I do and what we have you do in the pattern is to cut pieces 1 and 2 together with the fabric folded. So essentially, you'll be cutting the 2 pieces like this at once. So just lay out piece 1, and then we'll trim off the excess for piece 2 later, and I'll show you that later in the video. Once you've figured out where and in which direction your pattern pieces should lay, we'll need to make sure they're aligned parallel to the selvage and fold so that they're properly on grain. The back, yoke, collar, and collar stands are to be cut on the fold, so those 3 are easy. You just simply make sure it's aligned at both edges and secure it in place. For the front, you can use measuring tape and just measure from the selvage over to the grain line. I weight my pattern pieces down with professional cloth weights, but you can use anything. Cloth weights, also known as pattern weights, are made from cast iron and weigh about 4 pounds each. They're made to weight a pattern to cloth while tracing and cutting, and are low profile so you can easily maneuver around them. You can find these at any pattern making supply store. Small cloth weights for home sewing are available at most sewing supply stores, or you can use washers, cans of food. Anything relatively heavy and low profile works great. Another option for keeping your patterns in place is pinning it to the fabric. I personally avoid this method if you're working with a non-tissue pattern, as it raises the fabric in the area of the pins and can sometimes create a jag in the cutting line in the area where the pins are. It can also be hard to cut around a curved edge with the pattern pieces attached, but if you're using tissue like this, you can just simply pin right through the fabric and the tissue. All that said, to trace, I use either a marking tool with a chalk wheel, a fine point mechanical chalk pencil like this, or a plain old number 2 pencil. When cutting, you want to cut off the lines you've marked, so you can really use anything you want that doesn't bleed with no trouble. So to trace, you're going to simply just start going around your pattern with your tracing utensil. And make sure you mark your notches. And here you can see my line. I'm using black fabric with a white pen, chalk pen, because it was the combination I had that showed up the best. I want to make sure you guys can really see what I'm doing here. I will not be sewing this black archer on film, so don't worry about having to see what I'm doing there. But just continue to trace until all your pieces are traced off. Don't forget to mark the pleat at center back. And here you can see the armhole traced off. Before removing your pattern pieces, you'll need to transfer a few markings, specifically the pocket placement markings on the front pieces and the sleeve placket markings on the sleeve. There are a few ways to mark these. I personally just place a pin right through the pattern and I mark it that way. But you can use chalk, a thread tack, anything you like that you're used to using that works for you. Totally great, use that. Now that your pattern pieces are traced, it's time for us to cut. You can use either a scissor or a rotary cutter, whatever you feel most comfortable with. I'll be using scissors because that's how I roll. Cut around your pattern pieces. Don't forget to clip your notches, and when clipping your notches, make sure you don't go more than halfway into the seam allowance because we don't want that cut to go past the seam line. So the seam allowances on the archer are 1/2 inch, so you'll clip your notches at 1/4 inch or less. So just continue cutting. Now place piece 2, which is the right front, over top of the right front you cut. You'll align it along the neckline, shoulder, armhole, side seam, and hem. Weight that down, and then trace along the center front of that pattern piece. Make sure to mark your notch. Remove the pattern piece and then cut. Notch your front and then discard this piece right away. A lot of people accidentally try to use it as the button band because it's almost the same width. It's about 1/2 inch more narrow. And you don't want to try to take out your button band after you've sewn that on. So just throw this out right away. Once you have all your pattern pieces cut and marked, you're ready to cut the interfacing. This is a confusing topic to many, so our next video lesson will be entirely devoted to just that. I hope the information in this video helps you get past any trepidation or confusion you might have had about cutting your archer. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any videos. I'll see you back here to talk interfacing next time. Bye!